He was the last child no one wanted, barefoot, silent, clutching a newborn in his arms. The crowd turned away, but one man, a widower who believed he'd never be a father, stepped forward. The boy didn't cry, not even when the crowd laughed. He just stood there, arms wrapped tight around the bundle of cloth nestled against his chest, eyes too hollow for someone so young. 8, maybe 9, but worn down like a man twice that. His hair hung in damp clumps against his forehead, his boots long gone, replaced by bandaged feet darkened by dust. The auction block beneath him creaked, splintered with bruising his heels as he shifted his weight, waiting for something to change. But nothing did. They'd sold off the others, 10 children in all. Quick, like cattle, names barked out and coins exchanged. The first few were taken with sympathy, the middle ones with greed. But this boy was the last. And no one wanted what he carried. "Let's move on," a man in a bowler hat called from the side. "Ain't nobody buying 2 mouths for the price of 1. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Heat radiated off the sun-baked dirt, baking sweat into skin, sharpening tempers. A baby cried, high and shrill, from somewhere in the town beyond. But the bundle in the boy's arms remained silent. No sound, no stir. Just that eerie stillness that made folks uneasy. Sheriff Dorman scratched his neck, uncomfortable. He'd already pushed things further than he liked. Didn't sit right, selling children. But the territory was broke, and after the fire took the orphanage down to its bones, there hadn't been another place to send them. The church had no room. The townsfolk had no patience. So here they were. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "This one here, name's Caleb. 9 years old. Comes with his little brother, born just 2 weeks ago. Healthy enough. Both quiet. Still no bids. Strong boy," the auctioneer added, voice cracking with desperation now. "Can work. Knows how to milk, chop kindling, carry water. He's got a baby a woman snapped. He ain't worth nothing with a squalor hanging off him." Caleb flinched but didn't speak. Just rocked slightly, shifting the newborn tighter against his chest. The baby stirred, just a flicker of movement, and settled again. At the edge of the crowd, a man in a dust-covered duster watched. He hadn't moved since the bidding started, hadn't spoken, just stood with his hands folded over the head of a walking stick, his broad frame still as carved stone. His name was Abram Cutter, and 5 years ago, he'd buried his wife beneath a hill of wildflowers on a ranch that hadn't seen laughter since. The doctor said he'd never have children, and after Abigail died, he didn't want to. He worked his cattle, repaired his fences, and stayed out of other people's lives. Until now. Something about the boy on that block, the way he didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't hope, toward something in Abram that had been dead for years. He stepped forward. The crowd parted without realizing. "I'll take him," Abram said. The auctioneer blinked. "Both of them?" Abram nodded once. "Both. The $5? I got land," Abram said. "I got food. I got hands that need filling. That enough?" The sheriff moved to intervene, but the auctioneer held up a hand. His face softened, more than most. The hammer came down. Caleb didn't move. "Come on, son," Abram said, quieter now. "Time to go." For a long breath, the boy didn't react. Then, slowly, he stepped off the platform. The crowd said nothing. No years, no goodbyes, just silence. Abram turned and walked back the way he came, not waiting to see if Caleb followed. But he did, barefoot, carrying his brother. They rode back to the ranch in a silence as thick as the dust on the trail. Abram didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Caleb didn't offer answers. The baby didn't make a sound. Every mile between the town and the ranch stretched like thread between strangers, frail, thin, but there. When they reached the wooden gate, Caleb's eyes flicked upward for the first time. He read the sign etched into the arch, Cutter Homestead. Beneath it, another word had once been carved, now faded by time, hope. Abram noticed him staring. My wife named it that. Said every home needed it. Caleb didn't respond. Inside, the house was plain, sturdy wood, clean walls empty. Too many rooms for one man. Abram pushed open a door near the rear of the hall. This was hers, he said. Clean it once a week. Never used it since. The crib in the corner still had its blanket folded. Dust danced in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the cracked shutter. Caleb stepped inside without asking, crossed to the crib, and laid his brother down with a gentleness that made Abram's throat tighten. The baby stirred, lips parting, but didn't cry. "What's his name?" Abram asked. "Matthew," Caleb said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And yours?" "Caleb." Abram nodded once. "You hungry?" Caleb didn't answer. They ate in silence. Biscuits and beans. Water from the well. Later that night, Abram sat on the porch, pipe untouched in his hand. The moon was high. The coyotes were distant. Inside, he heard soft footsteps. Caleb pacing the floor, checking on Matthew. Again and again. It was an hour before the door creaked open and the boy stepped outside. "Is it always this quiet?" Caleb asked. "Most nights." Caleb nodded. "I don't like quiet." "Me neither," Abram said. "But you get used to it." They sat for a long time without speaking. Then Caleb said, "He hasn't cried since Ma died." Abram turned. "She was holding him." Caleb continued, voice dry and flat. "House caught fire. She handed him to me through the window before it collapsed. Her hair was on fire. She didn't scream." Abram said nothing. Caleb's fists clenched. "They said it was lightning, but I saw the torch. Someone set it." Abram didn't ask who. Didn't need to. The next morning, the baby cried. Loud and sudden, just before dawn. Caleb jumped awake and rushed to him. But it was a good cry. A real one. Hungry. Needing. Alive. Abram brought warm milk and bread. Matthew drank greedily. And for the first time, Abram saw it. A flicker in Caleb's eyes. Not hope. Not yet. But the memory of it. That afternoon, while repairing a gate near the west pasture, Abram spotted boot prints he didn't recognize. Fresh. Too fresh. He didn't mention it to Caleb. Not yet. But that night, he locked the doors for the first time in months. Oiled the hinges on his rifle. Set his tools close by. Trouble wasn't far. And if it was what Abram suspected, it wouldn't come asking nicely. The next day, they rode to Clearwater for supplies. Caleb insisted on carrying Matthew in the sling Abram had fashioned from an old feed sack. The baby slept, warm against his brother's chest. At the general store, whispers followed them. That the boy from the auction? Why's he still got that baby? Cutter lost his wife years ago. What's he want with orphans? Abram ignored them, but Caleb didn't. His jaw clenched. His spine straightened. And when a drunk stepped forward and said, "Best give that squalor to someone who can raise him proper," Caleb looked him dead in the eye and said, "He's mine." Abram didn't have to intervene. The drunk backed off. Back at the ranch, Caleb sat on the porch with Matthew nestled against him and asked, "Did you want kids?" Abram hesitated. "I had names picked," he admitted, "before the doctor told us it wasn't going to happen." "What names?" Abram chuckled dryly. "Jacob and Ruth." Caleb looked down at Matthew, then back up at Abram. "Can I call you something?" Abram blinked. "What?" Caleb shifted Matthew in his arms, then said, soft but clear, "Papa." Abram didn't answer, didn't trust his voice. He just nodded. And for the first time in 5 years, the quiet of the ranch didn't feel empty anymore. 3 weeks passed, and the ranch began to change in quiet, invisible ways. Not in the fences or the fields or even the house, but in the rhythm of it all. In the way footsteps moved through the dirt, in the voices that filled the kitchen at sunrise, and in the way Matthew's cries echoed, not with sorrow, but with life. Abram Cutter, who for 5 long years had lived in a home full of echoes and dust, now found himself waking not to silence, but to a boy calling "Papa," and the soft whimper of an infant wanting milk. He was learning, slowly, painfully, what it meant to be needed again. Caleb didn't speak often, but when he did, the words were sharp and careful, like he measured each one before setting it down. He worked hard, even harder than Abram, dragging the water bucket twice his size, sweeping the porch, tending the small vegetable patch near the west fence. And he never left Matthew's side. Not once. "Does he ever sleep without you holding him?" Abram asked one evening as the sun dipped below the ridge. "No," Caleb answered simply. "You ever get tired?" Caleb looked at him, and Abram regretted asking. More tired when he's not near. That was answer enough. Still, for all the good days, the nights were restless. Not because of Matthew, but because of what Caleb didn't say. The name of the man who set the fire. The reason no one in town had taken the brothers in. The weight behind Caleb's eyes when he thought no one was looking. Abram recognized it. It was the look of someone waiting for something to find them again. Someone. It came to a head one night when Abram woke to the sound of hooves. Slow, deliberate, not the trot of a passing rider. No, this was someone riding up the trail, stopping just shy of the gate. Abram sat up, boots on the floor, rifle in hand. He stepped out into the chill and saw a figure watching from the tree-line. A man, lean, mean in posture, didn't move, didn't wave, just looked, and then turned and rode back into the dark. Abram didn't sleep that night. In the morning, he said nothing to Caleb, but he didn't let him wander alone either. Kept him near while chopping firewood. Had him read aloud while Abram fixed a wheel on the cart. Not for show, for sound, for proof that the boy was still there, still safe. Later, while they gathered eggs, Caleb finally said, "I saw him." Abram didn't pretend not to know who he meant. "Say, man." Caleb nodded. "Why'd he do it?" The boy's hands trembled over the basket. He said Ma owed him, that she'd taken something from him. But she didn't. She just helped folks. Taught kids to read, patched wounds, gave bread. That made some men angry. Said she was stirring things. He came one night drunk, yelling. Told her he'd show her what happened to people who didn't know their place. Next morning, she was dead, and he was gone. Abram felt heat rise behind his ribs. He'd heard stories like this before. Too many of them. Always ended with folks looking away. "Did you tell the sheriff?" Caleb nodded. And he said there wasn't proof. Said no witnesses, no confession, no justice. Abram tightened his grip on the hammer. "Do you know his name?" Eldon Rake. Abram went cold. He knew that name. 10 years ago, Rake had worked the lumber line out by Furnace Creek. Got fired after beating a man half to death over a card game. Went north for a while. Came back with a badge someone said he'd bought, not earned. Now he called himself a land overseer. Bought up property cheap, chased off settlers, made his fortune one shovel at a time. He ain't gonna stop, Caleb said quietly. He's gonna come back. Abram looked him in the eyes. Then we'll be ready. The next days were filled with preparation. Quiet ones. Measured. Abram showed Caleb how to oil the hinges on the doors so they didn't squeak. How to tuck a knife in your boot without cutting yourself. How to spot fresh tracks in the dirt, even after the wind passed through. He didn't treat it like fear. He treated it like farming. Something you did because you had to, because not doing it meant going hungry, or worse. One night, after Matthew had finally fallen asleep in the crib, Abram pulled a bundle from under the floorboards. A revolver wrapped in oilcloth and a badge, old, tarnished, but still gleaming in the low light. "You was a lawman?" Caleb asked. "Once," Abram replied. "Didn't make me a good one, but I tried." Caleb stared at the badge, then back at Abram. "Why'd you stop?" "Because trying ain't always enough." They sat in silence a long time after that. The next morning, the fence on the south pasture was cut. Abram found the tracks, for men, booted, heavy set, not bothering to hide their trail. Just a message, a slow breath of warning. He stood at the edge of the field, watching the ridge. Matthew cried inside. Caleb called for breakfast. And Abram Cutter realized something he hadn't admitted since Abigail died. He was afraid, but not for himself, for them, for what he'd found again, too late to know what to do with it. Later that evening, a note was pinned to the barn with a hunting knife. Scrawled in crooked ink, "Give back what ain't yours, Cutter, or watch it all burn." Caleb found him reading it. What does it mean? It means trouble's here. Caleb's face tightened, but he didn't run. "I'm not going. I wouldn't let you." Abram burned the note in the fire that night. Didn't say a word about it, but he spent an hour cleaning every gun in the house. The following day, Abram sent word to a man in Sable Junction, Warren Tate, another ex-lawman, one of the few he still trusted. Riders were coming, and Abram knew they wouldn't wait long. But before the fire and bullets, there were days, small days, precious ones, where Matthew learned to crawl, dragging his tiny hands across the wood floor with surprising strength. Where Caleb laughed, truly laughed, when the goat headbutted him clean off his feet. Where Abram caught himself humming as he fixed the porch steps, unaware until Caleb looked up and said, "That was Ma's song." The boy's face was solemn then, but not sad. That night, as a storm rolled in from the east, Abram sat on the porch with Caleb beside him, Matthew asleep on the blanket between them. Thunder cracked, and wind whipped through the trees. Abram said, "What if I'm not good at this?" "At what?" "Being a father?" Caleb didn't answer right away. Then, soft, "My ma used to say you don't have to be good at loving. You just got to choose to keep doing it, even when it's hard." Abram stared into the dark and decided he would, no matter how much it cost. They were his now, all of them, and anyone who wanted to take that away, well, they'd have to bury him first. Dawn came silver and brittle. Rain had passed overnight, leaving the Cutter Ranch soaked and heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. Abram stood at the edge of the barn, boots sunk deep into the mud, staring at the broken fence again. Though it hadn't been chewed through by cattle or splintered by storm. This was deliberate, measured, a message, another one. Behind him, the house stirred to life. Caleb's voice, soft but steady, filtered out from the kitchen window. He was reading again, teaching himself from the worn old Bible Abram kept on the shelf. The boy had made a habit of it, his finger trailing along each word, repeating it quietly, sometimes mouthing the ones he didn't yet understand. Abram never interrupted. There was something holy in that sound, something stronger than the dust and the looming trouble. Matthew's cries followed soon after, fussy, tired but alive. Abram couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a wide smile, and it didn't reach all the way to his eyes, but it was real, and that was more than he'd known in years. Then the rider came. He heard him before he saw him. Fast hooves slicing through wet gravel, splashes from puddles kicking high. Abram turned toward the ridge, saw the figure lurch over the crest and descend hard toward the ranch. For a heartbeat, he reached for his rifle, but then the man raised a hand. Not a threat, a warning. Warrantate. He rode fast, but his horse was spent. The beast wheezed and stumbled as it reached the gate, foam frothing at its bit. Abram was already there to catch the reins, helping Warren down. "You look like the devil chased you straight from the grave," Abram muttered. Warren didn't smile. He might have. They went inside, where Caleb stood by the fire, Matthew in his arms. Abram caught the edge of tension in the boy's shoulders. He nodded once, reassuring. "This is Warren. Friend." Caleb didn't relax, but he nodded. He stayed silent, rocking Matthew slowly. Warren rubbed his face, shook off rain, and sat hard in the chair near the hearth. "I rode all night," he began, "from Jasper Ridge. Saw smoke rising near the Butte Trail. Homestead burned to cinders. Not a raiding party. Not bandits. Controlled fire. Fussed. Deliberate. I talked to survivors. One old man said they wore badges. Or what looked like him." Abram tensed. Eldon. Warren nodded. "He's got 6 men with him. At least. Says he's collecting squatters and property debts. But none of these folks owed anything. Just lived where he wanted to own. And the law." Warren spat on the floor. "Same as always. Bought or blind." Abram's gaze drifted to the window. Beyond it, the hills looked innocent. Still damp. Still green. But they were lying. He could feel it. A storm was coming. And this one wasn't made of rain. "We've got days?" he asked. Warren shook his head. "1, maybe less. I tracked them half the night. They're riding slow, probably waiting until they're sure there's no one left to stop them." Caleb stepped forward. "Why would he come here?" Abram looked at him long and steady. "Because you lived. Because you're not where he left you. And because monsters don't like reminders that they didn't win." Caleb didn't flinch. He just nodded. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Warren reinforced the door frames, hammered iron nails into the shutters. Abram dug out the second rifle from under the floorboards and checked the old bullets. Caleb gathered firewood, boiled water, and packed small bags, instinctively readying for the worst. Even Matthew, in his way, contributed, His cries masked the silence that otherwise would have driven them mad with waiting. That evening, Warren and Abram stood in the barn, sharpening blades under lantern light. The animals were restless, sniffing the air, stamping hooves. "You ready to do this again?" Warren asked. Abram didn't look up. Never was ready the first time. "You know they won't fight fair." They never did. Wool in sight. "Kid's tough. He's more than tough. Abram trailed off. Warren waited. Abram finished quieter now. "He's what I thought I'd never have." "You think it's worth dying for?" Abram turned, eyes hard. "It's the only thing that is." That night, they didn't sleep. Warren took the attic window, rifle pointed at the slope. Abram sat by the door, a shotgun across his knees. Caleb curled near the hearth with Matthew, keeping him warm with his own small body. In the darkness, Abram's thoughts turned inward. Not to fear. He'd felt that plenty. But to memory. To Abigail. To the way she used to laugh when the biscuits burned. To the names they whispered at night, dreaming of children they'd never hold. To the way he buried her in silence, because words didn't matter when hearts broke. He thought of all that. And then he looked at Caleb, and at the boy's steady, stubborn resolve, and at Matthew's tiny hand curled against his brother's chest. And he realized something. This wasn't the end of something lost. It was the beginning of something fought for. The morning broke with mist, the kind that crawled low across the ground and made shapes in the trees that didn't belong. They heard them before they saw them. Riders, moving fast. 6, maybe 7. Warren tensed. They brought dogs. Abram gritted his teeth. "Means they're not here to talk." Caleb stood by the table, a knife hidden in his boot, another under his sleeve. Abram placed a hand on his shoulder. "If it comes to it, you take your brother and run. Out the cellar. Through the ravine. Don't stop until you hit the railroad tracks. I won't leave you. You will," Abram said, firm. "Because that's what fathers ask when they have to." Caleb's lips trembled, but he nodded. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the gate. Voices barked orders. Then silence. A single voice rang out. "Cutter, this is Eldon Rake. Step outside. Let's talk like men." Abram opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. He saw him right away. Eldon looked the same. Older, thinner, but the same cruel sneer, the same proud chin. His badge shone like a lie on his chest. The men behind him looked like bounty hunters. Rough, paid, disposable. Eldon raised a hand. "I see you picked up some strays." "I see you picked up some trash," Abram replied. One of Eldon's men spat. Another chuckled. Eldon's face darkened. "I'm here for the boy. And the child. He's not yours. He is now." Eldon shook his head. "You always were soft, Cutter. Could have been rich. Could have ruled this valley. But you picked honor over survival. Look what it got you." "Still breathing," Abram said. "Still free." Eldon's eyes narrowed. Not for long. And then all silence broke. Gunfire. Warren fired first, dropping one of the men with a shot clean to the shoulder. Abram ducked left, fired both barrels into the dirt in front of the others, scattering them. Dogs barked, charged, but Caleb from behind the shutter threw down a jar of live powder that exploded in a cloud. The animals yelped, turned tail. Chaos. Abram moved like a man half his age. Warren fired again, keeping the pressure. One man screamed, hit in the leg. Another crawled for cover behind the trough. Eldon cursed and charged forward, gun drawn. Abram met him in the middle of the yard. No words. Just fists. They hit the mud hard, rolling, punching, blood mixing with rain and dirt. Abram took a hit to the jaw. Eldon caught a knee to the ribs. The fight wasn't clean. It wasn't fair. It was survival. Finally, Abram pinned him, rifle raised. But Eldon laughed, blood on his lips. "You can kill me," he rasped, "but others will come. Let them," Abram said, and brought the butt of the rifle down across his temple. Silence returned. Smoke lingered, and the Cutter Ranch still stood. Warren walked slowly down from the attic, limping. "We ain't too old after all," he muttered. Caleb emerged from the cellar. "Is it over?" Abram turned, looked at him, then at Matthew, then at the sun rising over the hills. And he said, "No, it's just beginning." The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. Blood washes off a porch, but not out of memory. Eldon Rake and 2 of his men had been buried in shallow graves along the northern ridge, Abram digging each one himself beneath a sky that refused to shine. Warren said it was a mistake. Burying your enemies marks the land with them. But Abram didn't care for curses. He cared for decency. Even in war, there were lines. And though the law hadn't shown itself that morning, Abram Cutter had lived long enough to know justice didn't always ride a horse or carry a badge. The rest of Eldon's men, those who hadn't been dropped in the dirt or driven off by Warren's bullets, had scattered. But Abram didn't believe they were gone. Men like that slithered. They waited, recoiled until they thought no one was watching. And while his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon each dusk, what kept him grounded, what tethered him to the present, was what remained behind him inside that house. Caleb was different now. He'd always been watchful, careful, a boy who carried more weight in his chest than most grown men ever would. But something in him had shifted. Not broken, not hardened, just sharpened, like steel put to flame. There was a calm to him now, eerie in its steadiness. Not silence, not fear, resolve. He sat with Matthew each morning, feeding him milk warmed in the pot, his voice a low hum as he recited Bible verses or lines from the old stories Abram had once read to Abigail. The boy had taken to memorizing things. Lessons, directions, names. Abram noticed it without comment. But inside, something stirred, something like pride, but heavier, deeper. Warren left on the 3rd day. "Can't stay," he said, strapping his saddlebag to the tired gray gelding. "Too many ghosts out here for me. But if word spreads, and it will, you send for me. I'll come back." Abram nodded. "Thank you." Warren glanced at the house. "That boy's going to be something. He already is." They shook hands like men who had once faced death together and knew not to ruin it with too many words. Then Warren disappeared down the trail, swallowed by trees and mist, and the Cutter ranch grew quiet again. Time moved strangely after that. Not fast, not slow, just full. They built new fences, planted more vegetables. Caleb insisted on keeping bees, so they crafted a hive box and carried it up the ridge where wildflowers grew thick. The boy worked without complaint, balancing Matthew on his hip while hauling buckets and mending chicken wire. Abram offered help sometimes, but mostly he just watched. Watched a child become a man without asking anyone's permission. Watched a brother raise a brother. Watched a life reshape itself around something unexpected and miraculous. And then one evening, something changed. It started with the sound of hooves again, but this time there were no shadows. No creeping dred. A wagon approached. Slow, cautious, dusty. A woman stepped down. She looked to be in her 50s, thin with hair tied back in a severe bun, hands calloused from farm work. Behind her, a boy of about 12 climbed down next. He held a rifle, but didn't raise it. They approached the house. Abram met them at the porch. "Can I help you?" The woman nodded. "Name's Marion Holt. This here's my grandson, James. We heard what happened. Rake, his men, the fires. We live east, near Dry Creek." Abram nodded. "We knew your wife," she added. "Abigail. Years back." Abram's jaw tightened. "I'm not here for anything," she said quickly. "Just wanted to say thank you for what you did, for standing when others wouldn't." Caleb stepped out onto the porch beside Abram, holding Matthew. Marion's eyes went to the boys. "They yours?" Abram didn't hesitate. "They are." She smiled faintly. "Then you're doing fine." They stayed the night, shared supper, talked of cattle and crops, in which creeks still held clean water. Nothing deep, nothing that hurt. But as Marion and James left the next morning, she turned and said, "More folks like us are coming. Ones who ain't got land, ain't got family, but they got hands. They'll need a place." Abram only said, "I've got fences to mend." She understood. Over the next few weeks, visitors came, quiet, grateful people with dust on their coats and hope in their eyes. Widows, veterans, young families with babies strapped to their backs and nowhere else to go. They brought little. Some had seeds. Some had tools. One man offered a pair of mules and a promise to dig a well so deep they'd never run dry again. Abram let them come, not because he wanted a town, but because he knew what it was to be turned away. He let them build small cabins along the ridge, gave them a patch to farm. Some helped with the cattle. Others built a schoolhouse out of scrap and ambition. Caleb was the first to enter it, sitting in the back with Matthew in his arms, a wooden pencil in hand. At night, the house glowed with lamplight and voices. Caleb began calling Abram Papa one day, not in ceremony, not even in thanks, just naturally, like it had always been that way. Abram froze the first time. The word hit him like a hammer. He hadn't expected it, hadn't earned it, but it came again the next day and the day after, and slowly he learned to answer to it. One evening, while repairing a stall in the barn, Caleb leaned against the fence and said, "I think Ma would have liked it here." Abram paused mid-hammer. "You talk about her much?" he asked. "Sometimes. When Matthew's asleep, I tell him stories." Abram nodded. "She'd be proud of you." Caleb looked up. "You think so?" "I know so." The quiet that followed was warm, like a fire that didn't need tending. But peace never stayed long. A rider came near dusk. A young man, breathless and pale, clothes torn. "They're coming," he gasped. "What's left of Rake's men. They've hired bounty riders. They're bringing chains." "How many?" Abram asked. "More than you've got bullets." Caleb stood near the porch, arms tight around Matthew. His eyes didn't waver. Abram didn't hesitate. "Then we don't fight alone." He sent messages that night, across trails, through town, to Marion, to the other families who had built homes on his land. He didn't ask for help. He just told the truth. "They're coming for us, but they'll take all of us if we let them." And the answer came back. "We'll be there." They came in ones and twos. Lanterns in the dark. Men with pitchforks and rifles. Women with sharpened spades and fire in their eyes. Some had never held a weapon before, but they came anyway. By dawn, 27 people stood at the Cutter Ranch. 27 hearts ready to fight for the children of a woman who once gave them bread when they had none. Abram stood before them. He didn't give a speech, didn't promise victory, just looked them in the eyes and said, "This is our land now. We don't give it up." They nodded. No cheers, no prayers, just resolve. And then the dust rose on the horizon again. They came as a wall of horses and leather, dust twisting up behind them like a second sky. 30 riders, maybe more. Hardened men, faces painted with anger or indifference. Some bore scars, others just the cold vacancy of those who'd been killing so long they forgot why. At the front, riding tall on a dark bay, was a man whose name Abram Cutter didn't know, but whose purpose was clear as fire. A bounty hunter, paid not in justice, but in coin. His coat was long, black, his gloves tight, and on his belt, not just one pistol but two, along with a coil of thick rope. Chains clanked softly against his saddle horn. He looked less like a man and more like a sentence. Death wrapped in a bad-shaped excuse. Abram stood at the top of the ridge, rifle across his chest, with Caleb at his side and the newborn Matthew tucked safe behind the thick walls of the old root cellar, buried beneath the hill. The makeshift community had gathered now, a scattered line of volunteers standing among the brush and split rail, pitchforks in hand, axes sharpened to cold silver. It wasn't an army. It wasn't even a militia. It was something more desperate and, in that, more dangerous. The bounty riders halted about 50 paces out, the lead man raising a hand. "Cutter," he barked. His voice was low, gravel pulled from years of gunpowder and grit. "You've been harboring fugitives, harboring children that ain't yours. We're here to collect. Stand aside." Abram said nothing at first. He just took a step forward. His boots crushed dry grass underfoot. Behind him, the wind was quiet. Not even the birds dared to speak. "They are mine," he said finally. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't shout, but somehow it carried. "And you'll not take them." A long pause. One of the riders chuckled. "You thinking this is going to end in anything but blood?" Abram glanced back at Caleb, who nodded, his chin high, his eyes calm. "If it ends in blood," Abram replied, "so be it. But it won't be theirs." The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. Then he gave the signal. Chaos broke like a wave. Gunfire cracked from the trees. Sharp, furious. One of the bounty men fell from his horse before he could even draw, a spray of dirt kicking high where his body landed. Another screamed as a rock, thrown hard from a farmer's hand, shattered his jaw and knocked him cold. But most charged forward, riding hard toward the ridge, firing blind. Abram dropped to one knee behind the fence post, sighted down his rifle, and fired. One rider pitched sideways, clutching his thigh. Caleb ducked low, grabbed the second rifle, and passed it to a young girl beside him, 12 years old, eyes hard, hands steady. 2 shots, Caleb told her. Make them count. She nodded. All around them, the fight turned brutal. Warren Tate had returned just before the shooting began, like a ghost. He'd taken the high hill to the right, his long rifle dropping enemies with eerie precision. 2 men made it past the front line and into the fields, until Marion Holt stepped out from behind a tree, shotgun leveled. She didn't flinch when she fired. They didn't rise. Still, the numbers were heavy. Abram saw one of the settlers, a boy no older than 16, get pulled from the fence by a rider and slammed into the mud. Before he could be dragged away, Caleb leapt the rail and drove a shovel into the attacker's ribs, forcing him back. Blood soaked the ground. Screams rose. Horses reared. The bounty leader watched from a distance, calm as a vulture. He hadn't drawn yet. He was waiting, letting his dogs do the mauling. And when 5 of his men fell, when the rest started to hesitate, he moved. He rode straight through the fighting, silent, precise, and leapt from his horse with the grace of a man who'd done this too many times. He landed not 10 feet from Caleb and Abram, guns drawn, both pointed square at Abram's chest. Drop it, he said, or I shoot the boy. Caleb froze. Abram didn't. He held his ground. You shoot him, he said, and you don't walk away. The bounty hunter smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was worse than that. It was empty. Ain't personal. Just business. But before he could pull the trigger, a sound split the air. Not a gunshot. A cry. Not a pain. Of defiance. From the cellar. Matthew. It was louder than it should have been. Impossible for one so small. But it carried through the hillside like a warning from heaven. A reminder that this child, this fragile, perfect thing, was not afraid. And in that moment, Abram moved. He stepped forward, rifle swinging up, even as the hunter's finger twitched. They fired at the same time. The bullet from the bounty hunter grazed Abram's shoulder, spinning him. But Abram's shot struck true, straight into the man's chest. The bounty hunter staggered, looked down as if surprised, then collapsed backward without a sound. The others saw it. Their leader was dead. And like ice melting beneath a morning sun, their courage vanished. The riders turned, fled. Some carried wounded. Others didn't look back at all. The battle was over. But not the war. Abram sat heavily on the step of the porch, clutching his shoulder, blood soaking his sleeve. Caleb ran to him, pale and shaking, but alive. He knelt beside him, whispering words Abram didn't quite hear, but felt. Matthew cried from the cellar again, and a neighbor rushed to lift the baby into the sun. There were tears, hugs, a strange silence that followed the storm. They buried their dead that evening, 3 from the homesteaders. One was Marion Holt. She'd been struck by a stray bullet while dragging a wounded man to safety. James, her grandson, stood alone by her grave as the last light faded. Caleb walked over, took the boy's hand, and didn't let go. That night, they sat around a fire. Not for warmth, but for memory. Abram, shoulder wrapped tight, held Matthew close, the boy swaddled in a blanket and sleeping soundly. Caleb sat beside him, his head against Abram's side, staring into the flames. I didn't think we'd win, Caleb said quietly. We didn't win, Abram replied. We survive. Same thing. Not always. But sometimes it's enough. The fire cracked. Sparks danced up into the dark, like spirits rising. Caleb shifted. Can I ask you something? Always. Why'd you do it? Why'd you take us? Abram looked at him. The boy's eyes were wide, full of the questions too big for his years. I don't have a good answer, Abram said. Only that I was empty. For a long time. And when I saw you, I didn't want to be anymore. Caleb nodded slowly. Papa. Yeah. I don't think she'd mind. Who? Your wife. Abigail. Abram swallowed hard. No, he said. I don't think she would either. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened. The Cutter Ranch became something it had never been. Whole. The fences were rebuilt. The barn mended. A new schoolhouse finished, with windows facing east. The other settlers stayed, some moving closer, others simply passing through for a time. But all carried a piece of what had happened there, a truth they'd share with others. That courage didn't come from guns or anger, but from love, from a choice to stand. And in the center of it all, Abram Cutter became something no one, least of all himself, had ever expected. A father. He wasn't perfect. He was still quiet, still slow to smile. But now, when he looked across his land and saw Caleb tending to the fields or heard Matthew's laugh echo from the porch, something inside him healed a little more. There were still shadows, still ghosts, but there was also light. And each morning, when the sun rose and the wind carried the scent of cut grass and wood smoke, Abram would close his eyes and say the same 3 words under his breath. Thank you, Lord. Fall bled slowly into winter. The leaves turned rust red and gold across the hills behind the Cutter Ranch, their colors sweeping down like fire across the valley, and then, just as fast, falling. The air changed first. Crisper, drier, the kind that cracked lips and whispered frost across windows before the sun had a chance to wake. The harvest came early that year, whether it was God's hand or just the stubborn work of desperate folks who refused to give up. The land gave more than it should have. Squash stacked deep in baskets, corn high and fat, potatoes packed thick into cellars that only months ago had hidden children from the sound of death outside their walls. And Matthew was crawling. Not just crawling, but fast. Every time someone blinked, he was gone again. Across the kitchen floor, under the table, down the hallway where the old floorboards creaked like a hymn. His laugh, sharp and bright, rang like a bell through the cabin, often followed by the sound of Caleb running, shouting Matthew, no, as the boy reached for yet another pot, another boot, another dogtail. It was strange, in a way, how normal could sneak up after something like what they'd survived. Caleb had grown too. Not just taller, though he had, but steadier. His shoulders squared more when he walked. His jaw set tighter when he listened. He read every evening now, devoured the books Abram had once left untouched on Abigail's old shelf. The Bible, of course, always close, always open, but other stories too, of men and kings, of battles and journeys. And when he wasn't reading, he was watching, learning, helping Abram with the fences, measuring timber, making small repairs around the ranch before Abram even noticed they were needed. Sometimes, Abram would just stop and look at him. This boy who had walked into his life, carrying a baby and nothing else. This boy who called him Papa now without hesitation. This boy who had, with no permission or plan, taken up the empty corners of his heart and filled them. Abram never said much about it, not out loud. But sometimes in the dark, he'd sit beside the fire long after Caleb had gone to bed and whisper a prayer, not one for more, not one for safety, but simply for thanks. I don't know why you gave them to me, he'd say, low and reverent, but I'll carry them as long as you let me. But peace doesn't always last in the West. It tests you, waits until your back's turned, until you start believing the worst is over, and then it strikes. It began with smoke. Not fire, but smoke, thin trails of it seen rising from the western ridge, far from any known homestead. Warren Tate was the first to spot it. He'd returned weeks ago to settle nearby, building a small cabin of his own and offering his rifle when needed. That morning, he rode hard down to the Cutter Ranch, eyes grim, lips tight. Campfire, he said, dismounting. But not ours. Someone's moving through. Riders? Abram asked, already reaching for his rifle. Could be. But I saw something else too. What? Wagon tracks. Big ones. Fresh. Wagons didn't just pass through the western edge. That part of the land was rock, sharp and cruel, not made for wheels. Anyone traveling there had reason, and not a good one. Later that evening, while Abram studied the tracks himself with Caleb at his side, they found the first sign. A scarf. Small, blue, and smeared with something dark and dried. Blood. Caleb picked it up slowly, turning it over in his fingers. "Kids," he said quietly. They followed the tracks west for another hour, through brush and tangled tree roots, until they crested a hill and saw what was left. The wagon had been burned, its wheels smashed, the canvas torn, its contents scattered like bones. A doll lay in the dirt nearby, missing an arm. There were no bodies, but there was enough blood on the stones to tell the story plainly. "They didn't just pass through," Caleb murmured. "No," Abram said. "They were hunted." "Why?" "Don't know yet, but we're going to find out." It didn't take long. By the next morning, another traveler arrived at the Cutter Ranch. A girl, no older than 14, half-starved and limping, with one shoe gone and her dress torn to the waist. She didn't speak at first, just collapsed into Warren's arms when he found her near the creek. It took hours before she could say her name. Ellie. She'd been with her family in the wagon. Parents, 2 younger siblings. They were heading west, same as many others who'd heard about the land that welcomed the broken and the bruised. They'd heard about Abram Cutter, heard about the town that had grown around him. But someone else had heard too. "A man in a gray coat," she whispered, "with iron on his boots. Said we didn't belong. Said he'd make an example." Her eyes were glassy, fevered. I hid under the wagon. Didn't scream. Not once. Mama told me not to scream. Abram carried her inside. He wrapped her wounds himself, sat by her bedside all night, and when morning came, he made a decision. They weren't going to wait for trouble anymore. They were going to find it first. Warren rode north to Dry Creek for supplies. Abram rode east to gather those still loyal to the dream of a place that welcomed all. Marion Holt's grandson James was among them now, quiet but unshaken. And Caleb. Caleb stayed behind, with Matthew, with Ellie, with the land. "I want to go," he told Abram before he left. "I know," Abram replied, "but this ranch needs someone strong, and you're that someone." Caleb nodded. He didn't argue. He was becoming the kind of man who understood that sometimes staying took more courage than leaving. Abram and Warren rode 3 days across the ridge, tracking the Graycoat Man. Found 2 burn camps along the way. One with another doll, one with a small boot, half buried in the ash. No bodies again, no names. But the message was clear. Someone was out there trying to break what they'd built. Not for money, not for land, for hate. It wasn't new, but it was bold. By the time they found the rider, it was snowing. He was alone at the edge of a cliff, watching the valley like a hawk. His coat was thick and long, his rifle resting across his lap. Abram didn't hesitate. He stepped into view, raised his voice. "You lost." The man didn't move, but he spoke. "No," he said. "I know exactly where I am." Warren raised his rifle, but the man just smiled. "You can't kill an idea," he said. Abram frowned. "What idea?" "That the West don't belong to the broken. That people like you, taking in strays, making home out of nothing, deserve to be reminded where they stand." Abram stepped closer. "You have a name?" The man grinned. "I've got plenty, but the one that'll matter is the one your boy'll remember. The one who taught him the world ain't kind." And then, without another word, he leapt. Straight off the cliff. Gone. No body. No sound. Just the howl of wind. Warren cursed. "What was that?" "A warning," Abram said. "He ain't the last." They returned to the ranch just as the first real snow began to fall. The cabin windows glowed. Smoke curled from a chimney. Caleb opened the door with Matthew in his arms, Ellie asleep by the fire. For a moment, all was still. Safe. But Abram knew better. The West never sleeps for long. Winter pressed harder than it had in years. The kind of cold that didn't just bite skin but got in under it, into bones, into memory. Snow stacked up past the fence posts, drifts curling like frozen waves against the barn. Nights were long, drawn-out things where the fire had to be fed near constantly, and every plank creaked with the kind of weariness only old wood and older men understood. But inside the Cutter Ranch, something else was rising, something no storm could touch. A family. Abram didn't say the word often. Still too new. Still something he held like a fragile egg in a weathered hand. But the truth of it was there in everything. In the way Matthew reached for him before sleep, fingers curling into Abram's beard with complete trust. In the way Caleb handled chores without being told, always aware, always watching. And how the others, the neighbors who once kept distance, now came by just to share bread or firewood or word of the road. The ranch had become more than a place. It had become a hearth. And Ellie, the girl who survived the slaughter on the ridge, was healing. Slowly. At first, she barely spoke, ate only when coaxed, slept with her back to the wall and one hand clenched. But time, kindness, and the quiet rhythm of the ranch began to stitch the broken places. Caleb sat with her in the evenings, reading softly from books she'd never known. Abram built her a new bed, sturdy and warm. Matthew, ever the innocent healer, often toddled to her with toys, sticks, buttons, carved animals. All gifts of a brother not by blood, but by bond. Still, the shadow hadn't passed, because rumors were reaching even the remote corners of their valley now. Whispers of more attacks, of wagons turned to ash, families vanished, and always behind it, the same cold mark, men who wanted the West to stay in the hands of the hard and the cruel, who saw mercy as weakness, who saw people like Abram as threats simply because they believed in something gentler. Then came the letter, delivered by a traitor, passed through 3 hands to get here. No return name, no seed, just a folded parchment that arrived one morning with a bundle of coffee and dried beans. Abram read it once, standing in the cold just outside the barn. Then he read it again. Caleb found him there, still holding it. What is it? Abram didn't answer right away. He passed the paper over. Caleb's eyes scanned the jagged handwriting. You have something that doesn't belong to you. You should have let the boy be sold like the rest. He's not your blood. He's not your burden. You got 1 week to send him to Dry Creek. After that, we come take him, and we don't come quiet. Silence fell like snow. Abram didn't curse, didn't rage. He just breathed. One deep inhale, one long exhale. Caleb looked up, voice flat. What are we going to do? Abram stared out at the tree line, where a hawk circled far off against the gray sky. We're not sending him anywhere, he said. Caleb nodded. I know. There was no argument, no fear in his voice, just understanding. Because this was home now, and you didn't give up family. Ever. That night, a meeting was called. Not just the ranch folk, but neighbors as far as 6 miles out. 50 people packed into the main barn, bundled in coats, huddled near lanterns, their breath steaming in the cold. Faces tight with worry, hands fidgeting with hats or scarves. Abram stood before them, not behind a pulpit, not behind a badge, just a man. A father. They've asked for a child, he said. My boy. They want him sent to Dry Creek. Claimed. Like property. He paused. His gaze swept the crowd. They say if we don't, they'll come. Murmurs rippled. A woman near the back, a widow from the far side of the ridge, stepped forward. You think they mean it? Abram didn't hesitate. Yes. Then we can't wait, said another man. We gotta move. Hide the boy. We've hidden enough, Abram replied, his voice steady. We've run enough. We stand now, or we never stop running. Some looked uncertain. Others nodded, jaws set. Ranch is fortified. Warren Tate added from his place beside Abram. Root cellar. High ground. We've seen worse odds. But this isn't a war, the widow said. This is a child. Abram turned to her. I know. He looked at Matthew then, bundled in Ellie's arms near the barn's far wall. The boy gurgled, blissfully unaware of the weight resting on his tiny shoulders. But that child is a symbol now. Not just to them, to us. He's the line we draw. The moment we stop letting fear decide who we are. A long silence followed. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. Not all, but enough. They would not send the boy. They would fight. The days that followed were full of preparation. Fences were reinforced. Traps laid. Rifles cleaned, bows strung. Children were taught how to signal danger. Fires were kept low after dark. And amid it all, life still pulsed. Caleb continued teaching Ellie to read. Abram continued carving Matthew's first wooden horse. Meals were shared. Hymns still sung on Sunday, even if the church had no roof but stars. And then, 7 days later, they came. A dozen riders, this time not 30, but leaner, smarter, and worse, they wore no insignia. No vallis, no calers, They came dressed like settlers, wolves in shepherd's wool. They rode into the valley at dusk, blending with the light. They dismounted at the edge of the trees, unsaddled with quiet precision, and moved toward the ranch on foot. Abram had expected it. He waited on the porch, Caleb beside him, rifle in hand. Warren circled wide in the dark, bow drawn. Others waited in barns and cellars, hidden behind root stacks and snowdrifts. The first man to reach the house stepped forward as though he were lost. Thin, pale, with a coat stitched at the elbow. "You Cutter?" he asked, like he already knew. "I am." "We came for the boy." Abram didn't flinch. "You're not taking him." The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You're not a lawman. You're not blood. What makes him yours?" Abram stepped down from a porch. Snow crunched. He didn't raise his weapon, just his voice. Because when he cried, I answered. When he needed arms, mine were open. And when he had no name, I gave him one. The man tilted his head. "Then you'll die for him." Abram didn't hesitate. "Yes." A gunshot rang out. But not from the front, from the trees. One of the raiders screamed, falling into the snow with a shaft in his side. Warren's arrow, silent and sure. Chaos erupted. The man before Abram lunged, but Caleb tackled him before he could draw. Two more came from the left, only to trip the wire strung between posts, sending them sprawling into the dirt. The ranch erupted. Gunfire, screams, wood splintering. But it was not like before. This time they were ready. This time they fought for home. For family. Ellie, tucked behind the root cellar with Matthew, sang softly to calm the baby. Her voice didn't shake. She'd learned that fear had no place where courage was chosen. The attackers fell one by one, not to overwhelming force, but to precision, to resistance born of love. By the time dawn cracked the sky, only two of the men remained standing, and they ran. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. The valley fell silent. Smoke curled from spent rifles. Snow soaked with the heat of battle. Abram stood in the yard, breath visible in the morning chill, rifle slung across his back. Caleb came to his side, cheeks flushed, one sleeve torn, but otherwise whole. "They're gone," he said. "They'll send more," Abram replied. "I know, but we'll be ready." Caleb nodded. Then, softer, "He's safe?" Abram looked toward the root cellar, where Ellie now stood in the open, Matthew in her arms, one chubby hand waving at the wind. "Yes," Abram said. "He's safe." That night, they didn't sleep. They sat around the fire, same as always. And for the first time, Abram took out something he hadn't touched in years. A small locket, worn in silver, with a picture inside. A woman's face. Gentle, strong. He showed it to Caleb. "Abigail," he said. "My wife. She's beautiful. She would have liked you." Caleb looked at him. Would she have liked Matthew? She would have loved him. Caleb looked down at the baby asleep in his lap, then up at Abram. Then she'd be proud. Abram didn't answer, but his eyes said yes. They always would. The snow melted slow that spring. Where fire once raged, green began to creep in, cautious and quiet. Shoots of grass poked up through scorched patches of soil. Birds returned to the high branches. Life, in its stubborn way, refused to stay buried. The ranch, battered but standing, bore every scar like proof that mercy could still survive the cruelty of men. The valley didn't forget what happened that winter. Folks spoke of it in low voices, how a man with no blood ties refused to give up a boy who wasn't his. How a town came together not out of law, but love. Word spread farther than anyone expected. Downriver traders passed it along. Mail couriers carried it from one depot to the next. It made its way to counties that hadn't even known the Cutter name, to camps where orphans huddled by railways, to churches whose pews hadn't been full in years. Some said it was just a story, a legend, maybe. Others said it was proof that something sacred could still be carved out of a hard land. For Caleb, it meant the world had changed. He'd spent the first 9 years of his life running, shrinking, praying someone would see him without turning away. Now, when he walked into town, folks nodded, tipped hats, asked him how the baby was doing. He had chores now, responsibility, a place at the table. In that sense, the one that had chased him like a shadow, always whispering that he didn't belong, had gone quiet. Matthew was walking, stumbling, really, but fast and determined. The little boy toddled around the house with the grace of a wind-up toy, bumping into chairs, walls, goats, anything unfortunate enough to be in his path. His laugh had changed too. Bigger now, deeper. He laughed like he knew he was safe, like he believed it would stay that way. One evening, not long after the first buds bloomed along the fence line, Abram found Caleb standing alone in the barn. The boy was staring at the saddle rack, a hand resting on the old leather. His face looked older than his years, not hardened, but thoughtful, shaped by more than most men twice his age had ever carried. "Something on your mind?" Abram asked. Caleb turned. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. Why didn't you ride away that day?" It was a question that had never been spoken aloud, not once since the auction. Caleb hadn't dared. Abram hadn't needed to hear it to answer in every action since. But now, it hung between them like mist. Abram stepped inside, closing the barn door behind him. He took a seat on an overturned barrel and let out a breath slow and deep. "Because I saw myself," he said finally. "In me." Abram nodded. "Not in your face, not even in your story, but in your fight, in how you held your brother like the world was ending and he was the only thing that mattered. That's what I used to be, a man holding on to someone he couldn't lose." Caleb looked down. "I thought. Maybe it was pity." "No," Abram's voice sharpened. "Never pity. You had more strength in you than most grown men I've known. And when you looked at me, it was like God tapped my shoulder and said, 'You've been asking for purpose. There it is.'" Caleb's throat tightened. He couldn't speak for a moment. He just nodded, a quick, sharp nod. Then he said it. "I love you, Papa." He hadn't said it since that first time. Not again. Not out loud. Abram stood, walked to the boy, and rested a calloused hand on his shoulder. "I love you too, son. Not boy, not kid, not you're like a son to me. Son." Caleb stood a little straighter. That night, they sat out under the stars. Matthew asleep in Abram's arms, Caleb leaning against the porch rail. The wind smelled of fresh pine and damp soil. A whippoorwill called in the distance. "You ever think of leaving?" Caleb asked softly. "Used to," Abram said. "Before you. Before Matthew. Thought maybe I'd head down to the Rio Grande. Warmer winters." "You still could." Abram looked down at the sleeping boy in his arms. "No," he said. "Everything I ever wanted is right here." Caleb smiled. He didn't need to say anything more. The next morning brought another letter. This one not folded in secret or passed through strangers. It came stamped and sealed, straight from the town council in Dry Creek. Abram read it slowly. Caleb watched him, brow furrowed. "Bad." Abram shook his head. "No, not bad." He handed the paper over. Caleb scanned the words. "To Mr. Abram Cutter, it is our understanding that you have taken into your care two boys, Caleb and Matthew, who were, until recently, without known guardians or legal family. In light of the defense you provided during the winter raid and the character witnesses from Dry Creek, Two Forks, and Bitter Hollow, we, the undersigned, offer full legal guardianship to you effective immediately. Both boys are now recognized as your sons under county law. No further action required. God bless." Judge Martinez. Langley Caleb's mouth parted, eyes blinking fast. "So it's real." Abram smiled. "It's real." Caleb didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, "Does that mean I can sign the ranch books now?" Abram laughed. "It means you'll be doing more than that. Got taxes coming. You think I'm keeping all that paper?" Caleb. Later that week, they held a small gathering at the chapel. Just a few neighbors. No preacher. Abram said what needed saying. He stood in front of the pews, one hand on Matthew's tiny back, the other on Caleb's shoulder. "These boys were given to me by grace. I didn't ask. I didn't earn it. But I was smart enough not to say no." He looked out at the gathered faces. "Family isn't made by blood. It's made by choice. And I choose them. Every day, every storm, every hard breath. They're mine. And I'm theirs." When he stepped down, Caleb took his hand. Matthew reached for both of them. And in that moment, under the quiet hush of wind through broken stained glass, something settled in the bones of everyone watching. This wasn't a story of rescue. It was a story of rebirth. A man who'd lost everything. A boy who'd been sold like cattle. A baby who shouldn't have survived the winter. They didn't just find each other. They became each other's answer. The months that followed were quiet, mostly. Not without trouble, but not without joy either. New families arrived, drawn by what they'd heard. A teacher came to the chapel. A midwife set up in an old grain shed. The Cutter Ranch became something like a town. Not big, not loud, but full of life. One day, while Abram carved Matthew's name into the barn post, just below Caleb's, he paused. The knife hovered. "What do you think your mama would say about all this?" he asked. Caleb thought a moment. "Then, I think she'd say thank you." Abram didn't speak. He didn't need to. By the end of that year, the valley had a name. The end.